All right. Good morning, saints. This is Prophet Roe Nabi, family prophet to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans. All right. Who are Israelites? Greetings to the four corners of the earth. I have a video here that was requested by one of my subscribers concerning Romans chapter 2. Sorry, Romans 8. And so this is a text of scripture that causes a lot of confusion, especially in the Christian church, because obviously they teach that you're not under the law. So they use everything that Paul says to prove that you are not under the law, but they don't know what it means to be under the law. So so let's look at these scriptures here. Pardon me. So let's look at these scriptures here in Romans 8. Let's jump right into it. Now, and I recommend that you read the whole book of Romans. But for now, we're just going to look at Romans chapter 8. All right. So the Bible tells us there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Mashiach Yehoshua, who walk not after the flesh, but after the spirit. So there are going to be people that are in Yehoshua in some way. And guess what? Romans 1 8 1 tells us they're going to be walking after the flesh. Maybe they're walking after the flesh due to inexperience. Maybe they're walking after the flesh due to rebellion. Maybe they're walking after the flesh because they're not born again. And when I say they are in Yehoshua, they are in him in name only. They, in other words, they profess to be in him, like the five foolish virgins in Matthew 25. The five foolish, for all intents and purposes, you can say they were in Yehoshua in some remote way. But guess what? The way that they were into Yehoshua was not sustainable because they did not have extra oil. So when you look at Romans chapter 8, verse 1, it says, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Mashiach Yehoshua. And then it qualifies it by saying, who walk not after the flesh. See, you're going to have those that appear to be or profess to be in Mashiach Yehoshua, but guess what? They walk after the flesh. They don't have extra oil in their vessels. Oh yeah, they got some oil in their lamps, but none in their vessels. And so when a crisis kicks off, they are scattering like roaches in an emergency. You see? So let's do something here. Let's go back to Romans chapter 7. Let's go back to Romans chapter 7. Now, the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 7, and I want to hit Romans chapter 7 because it leads up to Romans chapter 8, of course. So let's look at this. Romans chapter 8. 7 verse 1. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. Pay very close attention. Compare Romans chapter 7, verse 1 to Romans chapter 8, verse 1. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Mashiach Yehoshua, who walk not after the flesh, but after the spirit. But look what Romans 7 1 says. Now know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. Now let's unpack this. Let's go to Romans chapter 7, verse 2. For the woman which hath a husband, watch this, y'all. For a woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loose from the law of her husband. Now, a lot of times when Christians or people that study the Bible read Romans chapter 7 verse 2, they think that this is only talking about physical death. People read these scriptures like the Most High is not concerned about spiritual death. And I'm going to prove to you that the Most High is more concerned with spiritual death than he is physical death. Because he says, fear not him that can destroy the body. He said, fear not him that can destroy the body, but fear him that can destroy both body and soul. See, we don't put a lot of emphasis on this. We don't put a lot of emphasis on this area. Spiritual death. Spiritual death means that you don't want to have nothing to do with Yehoshua. You don't want to have to do anything for the Most High. Nobody thinks about that is a strong case for being free from a husband or a wife. Nobody factors that in. You know why? Because most people walk after the flesh. They don't walk after the spirit. The spirit doesn't have the weight of significance that flesh is. I mean, when Yehoshua was talking to Nicodemus in John 3, let's look at that. Look what he told him. Let's go to John 3, somewhere around verse 11 and 12. Now, look what he says here. Look what he says here in John 11, 3:11. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, we speak that we do know, and testify that we have seen, and ye receive not our witness. Listen very carefully. Look what he says in verse 12. If I had told you earthly things, and ye believe not, how shall ye believe if I tell you of heavenly things? You see that? Now he's talking to an Israelite, got on fringes. He's talking to Nicodemus, y'all. He's telling Nicodemus, you don't believe spiritual things, even though Nicodemus teaches Torah, quote unquote. Even though Nicodemus is a master in Israel, he don't know anything about spiritual things. His application of the law is earthly, is carnal. Yes, it is the law, but his heart applies it in a carnal fashion. And so in Romans chapter 8, verse 1, it says, there is therefore now no condemnation to them that are in Mashiach Yehoshua, who walk not after the flesh, but after the spirit. For all those Torah keepers who keep the Torah in the flesh, they are under condemnation. Not because the law is not good, not because the law is not holy, it's because they are not holy. They are not good. And by default, they are under condemnation. The law was never meant to be kept by people or interpreted or taught by people that walk after the flesh. Most people that teach the Bible walk after the flesh and not the spirit. They rehearse the righteous acts in the flesh, not the spirit. They are under condemnation, not because the law is not perfect and holy, because they are not perfect and holy. They have not been born again, just like Nicodemus. Look at this, y'all. Let me show you this. Look what he told in John chapter 3, verse 6. We're talking about those that are not under the condemnation in Romans chapter 8, verse 1. Look what he says. Let's look at John chapter 3, verse 6. It says this, that which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. Okay? You cannot be keeping the law of God in the spirit and the flesh. It's either one or the other. Most people who are screaming about keeping the statutes, laws, and commandments are keeping the law in the flesh. And they are under condemnation. And let me tell you why they're under condemnation. Not because the law is not holy and good, it's because they are not born again. They are not holy and good. They are not in Yehoshua in the most intimate way. That's why they're under condemnation. They are content with a superficial relationship with the husbandman. Just like many Israelite women are content with a superficial relationship with a husband. You got You got Hebrew Israelites women all over the place talking about they have a wicked husband, they actually stand in their way and they don't know what to do. That's a superficial relationship. Their husband or wife is actually dead in trespasses and sins. They're actually putting hindrances in the way. But what did we read already? See, a lot of people think that just because you're not having sex outside of marriage, you don't really have a strong case for divorce or separation. But if you look at the scriptures in Romans chapter 7, verse 2, it says, "For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead," dead how? He could be dead in trespasses and sin, y'all, not just dead in a casket. It says, "But if her husband be dead in trespasses and sin, she is loosed from the law of her husband." Yeah, she can make herself eligible for another husband. Why? Because her husband is dead in trespasses and sin. That's the greatest death there. The greatest death is not the death in a casket. The greatest death is being dead while you are living. Let me show you that. Let's go to uh First Timothy. Let's go to First Timothy chapter 5, I believe. Look at this, y'all. The Bible tells us in First Timothy chapter 5, verse 6, it brings out the concept of being dead even though you are alive. You're breathing, you're eating, you're going to work, you got a family you're taking care of, but you're dead. Watch this. But she that liveth in pleasure, listen to this, but she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. See, nobody factors this in. Nobody factors this death, this type of death in as it relates to marital relationships. So when you look at Romans chapter 7, verse 2, and it says, "For the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he liveth." When it's talking about he liveth, it's not just talking about spiritual, physical. It's talking about, of course, you're loose when he's dead physically, but the Bible is telling us that you're loose from the law if your spouse is alive but is spiritually dead. But if the husband be dead, she is loose from the law of her husband, and vice versa with the man. This is grounds for divorce, and this is grounds for separation. The Most High is making up the jewels to his kingdom. But a lot of people, they're more concerned about the physical death than they are about spiritual death. That's why you are rarely hearing somebody giving grounds for divorce if the spouse is spiritually dead. Nobody ever uses that as an excuse for divorce or a reason or cause of divorce. Now, let's keep going. So, let's look at Romans chapter 2, Romans chapter 7. Let's look at verse 3. So it says, so then, uh, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man. Now, listen to this, y'all. In Romans chapter 7, verse 3, it says, then if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. Now, if there is more than one type of death, namely spiritual and physical, shouldn't there be more than one type of life as well, spiritual and physical? Listen, so then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another. Now, Yehoshua said, I come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. That means that this is another type of life. So, any person claiming to be in the Mashiach, so look at this, Romans 7 3. So then, if while her husband liveth, in other words, the husband is living for Yehoshua. This is not just talking about physical living. It's talking about living for Yehoshua. He's born again, and the wife goes and sleep with another man. She shall be called an adulteress. Why? Because her husband is in the Mashiach. So if a woman steps out of her marriage, or a man steps out of his marriage, and his spouse or the spouse is uh, alive, and alive meaning they are in Yehoshua. They are in Yehoshua. They are born again. If if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. So you can see in Romans chapter 7, verse 3, when it says liveth, it's not just talking about breathing air, it's talking about having a spiritual life in Yehoshua. So the parameters for divorce and separation are a lot broader than people think. They think uh, divorce and marriage is just based on, sex, whether somebody is dead in a casket, and it's way deeper than that. Is this making any sense? If it's making any sense, give me a one. Let me proceed. Let's keep going. Let's go to Romans chapter 7, verse 4. Hey, native creation, shalom, shalom. All praises to the Most High. And thank you so much for all your willingness to help me with my little issues. I really appreciate that. That means a whole lot to me. So you're up early too. Now look at this in um, Romans chapter 8. Look what it says. Romans 7, verse 4. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead. Listen to this. Listen, and this is how we know that there's more than one spiritual, one type of death and one type of life. Wherefore, my brethren, he's talking to living people here. Ye also are become dead by the law, by the body of Yehoshua. So this lets you know that there is more than one type of death, and there's one more than one type of life. You are dead to the law by the body of Yehoshua. What does this mean? That ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that ye should bring forth fruits unto Yehoshua. So this means that the relationship that they had when they were dead by to the law, by the death, by the body of Yehoshua. Why are they dead to the law? By the death of Yehoshua. Does this mean that they don't keep the commandments? No, this means that the commandments have become an integral part of their characters. They're dead to keeping the law in the flesh. You hear that? Ye are also become dead to the law. How are you they dead to the law? These are the type of things that Paul says that are very complicated to people. And this is one of the reasons why people say that you are not under the law. Romans chapter 7, verse 4. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law. But the question you have to ask is how? How have they become dead to the law? Because they remember the audience that Paul is talking to are people who are works orientated. They are not spirit orientated. So yeah, they keep the statutes, laws, and commandments. They got the fringes, but guess what? They doing everything, every form of acknowledgement of the Most High in the keeping of the law is done in the carnal flesh. That that's why the Bible says right here in Romans 7:4, wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law. When Paul says this, he's talking about you're dead to the law in that you don't keep it in the flesh anymore. You see that? These are the intricate things and concepts that Paul often states that gets people tied up into knots. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law. How? By the body of Yehoshua, that ye should be married to another, that you should be married to Yehoshua. In other words, you are born again. Even to him who is raised from the dead, this is Yehoshua, that we should bring forth fruit unto Yehoshua. See, remember, Paul is primarily speaking to, in all of his letters, he's addressing men who keep the law in the flesh. And because they keep the law in the flesh only, they are under the curse of the law because the law is not designed for you to keep it in the flesh. It's designed for you to keep it in the newness of life by Mashiach Yehoshua. These are the things that gets people into tie their minds into mental knots when they read these things. They think that they think that um, Paul is advocating against the law. But what he's really advocating against is keeping the law in the flesh. That's what he's really advocating against. Let's proceed. I took a lot of time explaining that Romans chapter 4 so people don't get confused. Now, watch this Romans chapter 7, verse 5. For when we, watch this now, watch this. This backs up everything I've been saying. For when we, who is we? When Israelites were in the flesh. What does that mean? Let's unpack that. When Israelites were in the flesh observing Torah, The motions of sin, which were by the law, did work in our members. Why, though? Why did they work in their members? Because they were not born again. They were not born from above. They were born from scholasticism of studying the law, which is studying the law in the flesh. Listen to this. For when we, it means Israelites. For when we Israelites were in the flesh. Yeah, and when he says this, it's the implication is when we were in the flesh keeping Torah, the motions of sin were by the law, did not work in our members to bring forth fruits unto death. Sorry, did work in our members to bring forth fruits unto death. So whenever you try to keep the law, rehearse the righteous acts in the flesh, and you have not been transformed by the renewing of your mind, look what Paul says. It's going to work in your members to bring forth fruits unto death, not fruits unto the Most High. It's eternal death. Let's look at the next scripture here. Let's go to Romans chapter 7, verse 6. But now we are delivered from the law. Now, when it says delivered from the law, does it mean the deliverance from keeping the law? No, it means you're delivered from keeping the law in the flesh and not the spirit. Why? Because now you're born again. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead, because they was keeping the law in the flesh, wherein we were held that we should serve in the newness of life, newness of spirit, and not in the oldness of the letter. See, most Israelites, they keep the law in the flesh and in the letter. That tends towards the fruits of death. This is what Baptists don't understand. They think that they think that Paul is abolishing the law. But what Paul is really abolishing is keeping the law by the letter and by the flesh. Why? Because when you keep the law by the letter and by the flesh, that means you're not born again. You're not born from above. Is this making any sense? Because I'm being very methodical in trying to see. It's a lot that Paul talks about that people don't get. They really don't get it. But I'm taking my time right now, deliberately, and I'm showing you that he's actually explaining this. So let's look at Romans chapter 7, verse 7. See, when you understand Romans chapter 7, verse 7, you're going to have an easier time with Romans chapter 8 and the whole book of Romans. What shall we say then? Now, look what he asks here. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Now, why is he asking that? Why is he asking, is the law sin? Why is he asking that? Because the illusion that is given by those that keep the law in the flesh, that's the illusion that is given. because you have to base it on everything he's already stated. Look what he said in Romans chapter 7, verse 5. For when we were in the flesh doing what? Observing the law, rehearsing the righteous acts, wearing our fringes, praying, fasting in the flesh. You're not fasting and praying in the spirit. Look what it says. For when we were in the flesh, as what? Israelites, the motions of sin which were by the law. How were the motions of sin by the law? Because the people that were rehearsing the righteous acts were not born again. What happened? What's the fruit of that? Did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. Now you can understand why in Romans 7:7 he says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? And he says, God forbid. Is the law as it was designed and originally created? Is it sin? That's what he's asking in the life of an Israelite. And he says, God forbid. The law was really only made for those that walk after the Spirit. That's why he's asking, is the law sin? Because there are most people who observe the law, guess what? They observe it in the flesh or by the letter and not the newness of spirit. You see? For I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Well, yeah, he wouldn't know that. You know why? Because he was walking after the spirit. But there's other people who study that law, and guess what? They walk after the flesh. In other words, they end up lusting in their minds. They start lusting in their hearts. And they think that because they have concealed it in their minds and hearts, they are law keepers, when in reality, they are law breakers. So let's look at Romans 7, verse 8. These are very difficult scriptures for Christians and even Israelites to really get. And what you really need is a very patient and methodical teacher that's filled with the Ruach that's going to help you with these things. In Romans chapter 7, verse 8, but sin, watch this, but sin taking occasion by the commandments wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. What does this mean? But sin taking occasion by the commandment. How can sin take occasion by the commandment? It's based on everything I've already said. Sin takes occasion by the commandments because people are not born again. They're walking in the flesh, but they give an intellectual assent to keeping the law. That's how sin takes occasion by the commandments. And look what he says, it wrought in me all. In other words, Paul is saying because remember, Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees before he was born again. And so he's hearkening back to the time when he was keeping the commandments by the flesh. And look what he says here. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. You see that? Let's look up the word concupiscence. Let's really unpack that word. We're not just going to read over that. We're going to look up the word concupiscence.
Here's the definition of essence: the intrinsic nature or indispensable quality of something, especially something
Concupiscence.
abstract, that determines its.
Just a moment. I'm trying to get this definition here. Let's look up the word concupiscence. Okay, where am I at? Cup. The word concupiscence, it simply means strong sexual desire. Okay? Lustful, sexual appetite, sexual longing, sexual passion, ardor, desire, and passion. This is what concupiscence is. It's a strong sexual desire. Now, we could look at sexual desire from, and this is what the word concupiscence means. It means strong sexual desire in Romans chapter 7, verse 8. So let's read that again. But sin taking occasion by the commandment. How is sin able to take occasion by the commandment? And it's simply when a person is not born again, they're not born from above, but they're trying to, you know, mimic keeping the commandments. And that's all it really is mimicking. They might look real pious and they might be very generous, and but guess what? Sin is taking occasion by the commandment. Why? By default, because they're not born again. Wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. So while he was going through this charade of keeping the law, lust was fomenting and building up in his member. For without the law, sin was dead. What does that mean? Without the law, sin was dead. Without keeping the law in the flesh, sin dies, y'all. When you cease and desist from keeping the law in the flesh, guess what happens to sin? It dies. When you keep the law by the Spirit, sin dies. But when you keep the law in the flesh, you keep sin alive. And that's why it says, it wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. You see that? He's actually explaining everything as he goes along. Look at this. Let's go to Romans. Let's go to Romans. Okay, what's going on here? Romans chapter 7, verse 9. For I was, now listen to what Paul says here. For I was alive without the law once. What does that mean? For I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. Why? Because at this point in Paul's life, he wasn't born again. He wasn't born again. For I was alive without the law once. Hey, concerned mom, shalom. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived. See, Romans chapter 7, verse 9, shalom to you, to concerned mom. So in Romans chapter 7, verse 9, it states, for I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be death. I found to be unto death. Now, Romans chapter 7, verse 9 is really reiterating the same thing that's brought about in Romans chapter 7, verse 7 and Romans 7, 6. It's the same thing. He's stating the same thing in another way. Okay? So Paul is letting us know he's recounting his experience before he became born again. And let's keep going here. In Romans chapter 7, verse 11, once you get this teaching down right here, it's going to be very hard. And when I say get it down, I'm not just talking about get it down intellectually. You're going to have to get this down in your spirit. It's going to be very hard for Satan to deceive you. This is a very, very powerful and protective teaching. Listen to this. Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 7, verse 11. For, watch this, for sin taking occasion by the commandment. Now, how does sin again take occasion by the commandment? We already read this in Romans chapter 7, verse 8. The way that sin takes occasion by the commandment is because you are keeping the commandments in the flesh. You're not keeping the commandments in the spirit. In other words, you are not born again. This is how sin takes occasion by the commandment. And let's look up that word occasion. Let's look up that word occasion here. In Romans chapter 7, verse 8 and 11. This phrase occasion keeps popping up. It pops up in Romans chapter 7 and it pops up in Romans chapter 8. Now, it's pretty obvious what occasion means. It means, but let's look in the Greek and see how they unpack this. We're going to look at Romans chapter 7, verse 8. And the word occasion here is the Greek. It is the Greek word aphomoria, aphoria, aphomorme. Okay, aphomorme. Aphomorme is the Greek word, and it says a starting point. That is figuratively an opportunity or occasion. So It's just taking, it's exploiting the word occasion here. It carries the connotation. The word occasion here means that it's taking advantage. Sin is taking occasion or taking advantage of those that walk in the flesh by the commandments. Why? Because the people that are doing this are not born again. Yeah, they wear the fringes, they wear the borders of blue, they go to the feast days and all that, they rehearse the righteous acts, blah, blah, blah. But guess what? They're not born again. Because they're not born again, but they have a mechanical uh they have a mechanical affection towards the law. One of the recipes of that is that sin flourishes. And this is what Paul is bringing out right now. For sin taking occasion by the commandment. Okay, just a moment here. For sin taking occasion by the commandment. In other words, sin is exploiting an opportunity by the commandment. Now, what does that mean? That the people that are keeping the commandments, quote unquote, they are doing it in the flesh. That's how sin takes occasion by the commandment. When people who are not born again have a form of godliness in keeping the law, but they deny the power thereof. That's how sin is able to take occasion by the commandments. This is not saying that keeping the commandments makes you sin. This does not say that Paul is not saying here that keeping the law, it makes you sin. He's saying that when you're not born again and you're walking by the flesh, that superficial keeping of the law, that's that's how sin exploits the commandments, deceived me, and by it slew me. See? There's nothing good that comes out of keeping the law in the flesh. You see? For sin taking occasion by the commandments deceived me, by it slew me. Romans 7:12. Wherefore the law, look what this, the law is holy, and the commandment holy, just and good. In other words, the original purpose by which the Most High designed the law for people that walk in the Spirit, yes, it is righteous, it is holy, it is just, it is good. But it's not just and holy and good for those that are persistent on walking in the flesh. Is anybody understanding this? Let's keep going. Okay, we stopped on verse 12. So good, wonderful. So let's look at Romans chapter 7, and let's look at verse 12. These are very intricate things and spiritual things that a lot of Israelites and Christians, they just don't grasp. And the reason why they don't grasp it because they've been taught that Paul is teaching against the law. Even in Romans 7, they teach that Paul is abolishing the law. So when we look at Romans chapter 7, verse 13, look what happens here. Look at the natural progression in this critical thinking of Paul. Was then that which was good? Watch this. Listen to this. Was that was then that which was good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good. What does all this jargon mean? What is Paul talking about here in Romans chapter 7, verse 13? Was then that which was good made death unto me? Paul is asking, is the law, did the Most High make the law so it could kill me? No, the Most High didn't make the law so it can kill anybody. The Most High made the law so it can give life to those that walk in the Spirit. Now, when you misappropriate the law, yes, it does kill you. But that's not why he made it. It's because we are violating the natural laws of the universe, which is Torah, the natural results of that, not the imposed, but the natural results, not the imposed results from the Most High, is that you die. It kills you. So it's not the Most High that created the law so it can kill you. What the way you're living, that's what kills you. Walking in the flesh. Was then that which was good made death unto me? And he says, God forbid. But sin, ah, but sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me. See, it's sin that's working death in a person. It's not the law of the Most High. What is sin? Sin is the transgression of the law. That's what works death in you, not the law. When you jump off a building that's 15 stories, the law of gravity is killing you. Why? Because you're violating the law of gravity. It's not the gravity per se that's killing you. It's you violating the law of gravity. And so it's the same thing with the law of the universe, which is Torah. When was then that which was good made death unto me? God forbid. In other words, he didn't design it that it should kill you, but you violating it. That's what kills you, y'all. But sin that it might appear sinful, but sin that it might appear sin, working death in me. It don't say that the law here is working death in you. It says violating the law. That's what works death in you. But people want to blame the law. The people are blaming the law for killing them. No, it's you violating the law that's killing you. That that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. So the Most High has the law there so you would see what violating it, how exceedingly sinful it actually is. But a lot of people are blinded to this. They think the more that they break the law, the more that they are immune to the effects of it, which is death, just like Eve did. Now watch this. Look at Romans, look at Romans 7:14. When you understand Romans chapter 7, you're not going to have a problem with Romans 8. You're just not. For we know that the law is spiritual. Yes, the law was never created for carnal people to implement in their life. When a carnal person implements the law of the Most High in their life, and when I say carnal, that means they're not born again. They are not subjected to the law of God, which is spiritual, neither indeed can be, because spiritual things are spiritually discerned. They're trying to force, it's like going to the store and you wear a size 11, but when you go to the store, you buy a size 5 and you try to squeeze your big foot in a size 5. Well, guess what? There's going to be a lot of pain. The law of the universe is not created for people that are carnal. That's why it causes death. It's supposed to kill you because it's like trying to squeeze a size 11 foot into a size 5 shoe. It don't belong together. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin, not sold under the law. For that which I do, I allow not. And then it goes on, the good that I would that I do not, and that I don't do. You see, I'm not going to go through all that because he goes back and forth from that for a while. Okay, in Romans chapter 7. I've really given a good foundation for Romans chapter 8. You really got to understand Romans chapter 7 through 13. It unlocks Romans chapter 8 with laser precision. Nobody going to be able to defeat you if you start talking about this. Trust me. I've been on the battlefield with Romans chapter 7 and 8, and nobody can touch me. Nobody. And many of these concepts that I'm bringing out, most people have never heard before. But yet I'm reading it right from the Bible that everybody carries around. Why? Because spiritual things are spiritually discerned. It's not by scholasticism. It's not by uh, uh, literacy. It's by the Spirit, not by might nor by power, but by the Spirit. The reason why you have so many different variant explanations of Romans chapter 7 is because the people giving those explanations are not spiritual, and they're not even spiritual Israelites. Those are the people that's supposed to be explaining the books and writings of Rome, of Paul. Spiritual Israelites, mature spiritual Israelites, not Christians, not immature Israelites. So let's go over to Romans 8 with everything that we've discussed in Romans 7. Okay, just a moment. I'm going to end with Romans chapter 7, verse 25, 24 and 25 before we go into Romans chapter 8. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? This is what Paul asked. Let's read verse 25, the last verse in chapter 7, and let's get the answer. I thank Yahuwah through Mashiach Yehoshua, our Elohim. So then, with the mind, I myself serve the law, but with the flesh, the law of sin. And so, this is the dichotomy here. This is the bifurcation here. As we are living in a world of sin and being brought into the newness of life, there's an internal struggle where we serve the law of God with our mind. Why? The only people that can serve the law of God with their mind are those that are born again. But watch this. But just because you're born again, it don't mean that your flesh is not still responsive to the conditioning of sin. So there's this wrestling match between when you're born again, yes, there's a wrestling match between uh so then with the mind I myself serve the law of Yahuwah, but with the flesh the law of sin. And so we have to crucify our flesh on a daily basis. Okay? Now let's go to Romans chapter 8. So in Romans chapter 8, verse 1, it says, there is now no condemnation to them that are in Mashiach Yehoshua, who walk not after the flesh, but after the spirit. Now look at that. That's beautiful. There is now no condemnation to them that walk in Yehoshua. They're born, that means they're born again, who walk not after the flesh, but after the spirit. Let's keep going. See, there's going to be some people that say, Lord, Lord, didn't we do this? Didn't we do that in thy name? And he gonna say, no, you really wasn't in me. You wasn't really in me. Yeah, you did things in my name, but you really wasn't in me. You were still walking after the flesh because you were trying to keep the law in the flesh. You had a form of godliness, but denied the power thereof. For the law of the spirit, watch this, y'all. There are two different types of laws. For the law of the spirit of life in Mashiach, Yehoshua, hath made me free from the law of sin and death. What is the law of sin and death? The law of sin and death, in the context of an Israelite, the law of sin and death is trying to keep Torah in the flesh. In a nutshell, that's what the law of sin and death is. You're not born again, but you go through all the motions, keeping the Sabbath, keeping the feast days, rehearsing the righteous acts. And guess what? You're not even born again. That's the law of sin and death right there. Contextually, based on Romans chapter 7. When you go to Romans chapter 3, look what you have here. In Romans chapter 3, look, 8:3, look what it says here. For what the law could not do, watch this, for what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh. Why was it weak through the flesh? Because people were trying to keep the law by flesh. They were not born again. Rehearsing the righteous acts was just a custom for them, but there was no heart renewal. There was no heart transformation happening. It just became ritualistic. For what the law could not do, why is it that the law couldn't do something? Because the people that's trying to keep it are doing it in the flesh. In that it was weak through the flesh. He comes straight out and tell you, God sending his own son in the likeness of his flesh, in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemns sin in the flesh. So Yehoshua came as a spiritual being and he kept the law in sinful flesh. Why? Because his spirit was his core was spiritual. So he would became the great example or the great exemplar of how people that have sinful flesh must and can keep the law. So let's go to Romans chapter 8 verse 4. That the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. So Yehoshua as our example shows us how to fulfill the law, not in the flesh, but keep the law in the spirit, who walk not after the flesh, but after the spirit. See, this is the big dilemma with Israelites. Israelites cannot tell the difference between keeping Torah in the flesh and keeping it in the spirit. This has been the bane of our existence because we don't have spiritual discernment because we're not born again. If we was born again, we would be able to understand these things. Let's go to Romans chapter 8 verse 5. Oh boy, I'm having trouble here. Okay, there we go. So Romans chapter 8 verse 5 and 6. For they that are, watch this, y'all. For they that are after the flesh, they do mind the things of the flesh. Now, why is he saying this? He's saying this in context of Torah. Those that are after the flesh, they keep the law with a fleshly mind and heart, a carnal heart. But they that are after the spirit, they keep the law by the spirit. They're born again. Romans 8:6. For to be carnally minded is death. What does this mean in context of Romans 7 and 8? When you try to keep the law by the flesh or by the letter of the law, that's actually the law of sin and death. Not because the law is a sin, but the way you're keeping it is a sin. It automatically morphs into the law of sin and death because you're keeping it with a carnal understanding. For to be carnally minded is death. In other words, to be carnally minded and observe the law, that is death. But to be spiritually minded and observe the law, that is life and peace. See, a lot of people use Romans chapter 8, verse 6 to say that, see, if you keep the law, that's death. No, it's the way you keep the law. When you're keeping the law with a carnal mind, that is what the law of sin and death is. In other words, when you try to keep the 10 commandments in your carnal flesh with your wicked mind, that actually is the law of sin and death. So let's look at Romans, not because something is wrong with the 10 commandments, but something is wrong in your methodology of keeping it. And that's what a form of godliness and denying the power thereof really is. So we're going to look at Romans chapter 8, verse 7. This is not the type of stuff they teach in no Christian church. This is not really even taught among Israelites, y'all. It's really not. Because if you ask somebody to explain Romans chapter 7 and Romans chapter 8 to you, they're not going to mention any of these things that I'm talking about. And I'm willing to wager that if I was a gambling man, which I'm not. But if I was a gambling man, I would bet you he's going to go into a whole lot of spooky stuff. Look at this. They're going to explain Romans chapter 7 and 8 in a very spooky way. And you're going to be more confused after they get through explaining it than they was before. But the way that you hear me explaining it, you see that it's concise and it's consistent with everything that I keep saying. I'm basically saying the same thing over and over with every verse that I post. Listen to this. Romans chapter 8, verse 7. Because the carnal mind, what carnal mind? The carnal mind of Israelites that keep the law with a carnal mind, look what it says, is an enmity against God. So whenever you try to keep the law in the flesh, your thoughts are at enmity against the Most High. They trying to destroy the law of life and peace, which is the Ten Commandments. Whenever you try to keep the law, the 10 Commandments in the flesh, for it is not subject to, the carnal mind is not even subject to the law of God. That's why you have so many marriages where you have husbands that are not in subjection to the Most High, and you have wives that are not in subjection to the Most High. They are carnal minded because the carnal mind is enmity against God or the law of God. For it is not subjected to the law of God, neither indeed can be. Paul is telling us that a carnal mind can never be in subjection to the law of the Most High. Let's look at Romans chapter 8, verse 8 and 9. Okay, hold on a second. What's going on here? So in Romans chapter 8, verse 7, what's going on here? Don't know what's going on here. Okay. Romans chapter 8, verse 7. Because the carnal mind is enmity against the law of God, for it is not subject to the law of God. Yes, the reason why so many marriages are falling apart is because oftentimes you have one partner wake up and the other one don't wake up. And I'm not just saying waking up that you're an Israelite. That's not enough. But you wake up to the fact of how you're supposed to be in subjection to the law of God. And what that is going to do is cause tension in a marriage. And in many cases, you're going to have to part ways, period. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subjected to the law of God, neither indeed can be. Okay. So then, they that are of the flesh, listen very carefully. They that are of the flesh do mind the things. So they that are of the flesh, they can't please God. I don't care how much they rehearse the righteous acts in a mechanical way. They can't please God. They are an anathema or curse to God, to the Most High's law. They are a curse. Verse 9. But ye, excuse me, but ye are not in the flesh. Those that are born again, they're not in the flesh, but in the spirit. If so be that the spirit of Yahuwah dwell in you. Now, if any man have not the spirit of Yahushua, he is none of his. So non-messianics are by default the devil. They're not, they don't belong to Christ. I don't care how many righteous acts they rehearse. I don't care how many feast days they keep. They're of the devil if they're denying the Mashiach. Okay? And this is what they can't accept. Let's look at Romans chapter 8, verse 10. And if Yehoshua be in you, talking to those that are born again, the body is dead because of sin. The carnal life that you used to live, yeah, it's dead because of sin. But the spirit is life because of righteousness. You see? Paul is warning us in Romans chapter 7 that most Israelites that claim to be statute laws and commandment keeper, guess what? They're not even born again. It's rare that you run into a person that's an Israelite that's born again. It's rare. Just a moment. Okay, Romans 8:11. Okay. Okay, we're going to go to Romans 8:11. I'm sorry it's taking so long to post these scriptures. It's kind of a job. So let's look at Romans 8:11. But if the spirit of him that raised up Yehoshua from the dead dwell in you, He that raised up Yehoshua from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by the Spirit. In other words, he will cause you to be born again by the Spirit that dwelleth in you. You're going to begin a spiritual life in the same manner that he was raised from the dead. He's going to raise us from the the death of the dead of a carnal life in keeping the commandments. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh to live after the flesh. So after you're born again, you don't owe the flesh nothing else. You're born again, you're free, you're exempt from that debt. Romans 8:13. If ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. See, it's that, y'all, this is real simple stuff. But if ye through the Spirit, and when he says ye, he's talking about Israelites who claim to be keeping the law, but they're keeping the law in the flesh. He's saying, ye shall die. Yep, with fringes on. You're going to die at the Passover. hmm You're going to die at the Passover. While you profess to be keeping it, you're going to die. For ye live after the flesh. That's why you're going to die. Ye shall die. But if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. Paul is describing how to have life and have it more abundantly. Romans 8:14. And so Paul tells us in Romans 8:14, for as many as are led by the Spirit of Yahuwah, they are the sons of God. Not everybody with fringes on is a son of God. Not everybody that is an Israelite is a son of God. Though most of those people are devils. Okay? Romans 8:15. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but ye have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. This is the adoption of the Israelites back into the bond of covenant of the Most High, because they walk after the Spirit and not after the flesh. That's our adoption. Okay, let's get Romans 8:16. Goodness gracious. Yeah, I'm posting these scriptures sometimes. Get a little. The Spirit itself bear witness with our spirits that we are the sons of God. Who is the sons of God? Carnal Israelites? No. The ones that are the sons of God are the Israelites that are born again. The Israelites that are not born again are the children of Satan. I don't know why this thing keep jumping all around like this. My God. Okay. Romans 8:17. Look at this, y'all. And I'm going to stop soon. I want to stop soon. But look at this. Romans 8:17. And if children, then heirs, heirs of Yahuwah and joint heirs with Mashiach, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may be also glorified with him together. So I think I'm going to stop there. I didn't finish reading the whole chapter, but this really, Romans chapter 7 and the portion that I read in Romans chapter 8, it really gives you a, a real clear of what Romans 7 and 8 is all about. It's not about abolishing the law. It's about abolishing carnal people who try to keep the law. And then they use their standard as the standard instead of the standard of the Most High. The first standard of the Most High in keeping the law is that you have to be born again. The law was not created for sinner people to keep the law. That's why it's death to them, because they are actually violating a law in observing the law by being carnal. But anyway, I'm going to stop right there. I hope this has been a blessing to you. And if you have any more questions, please, anybody, let me know. This is Prophet Ro A. Nabi, family prophet to the angel of the church to the Laodiceans. If this teaching has been a blessing to you, if you enjoyed this teaching, give me a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up before you leave. All right. I would greatly appreciate that. But until next time, this is Prophet Roe Nabi saying shalom. Have a wonderful day. May the Most High bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. Shalom. Hey, y'all, son, what's going on? Shalom. Oh, oh boy. This is my first live since I've been on vacation. It's not really a vacation, but my visit. Let's call it that. But anyway, I'm out of here. Shalom.